Well, how's it going, everyone? This is Nick. Welcome to the New Testament Theologist YouTube channel. And today I am going to offer a theological and semi-exegetical and pastoral reflection on a passage of Scripture that has bothered me for a very long time. It's a passage that I've preached on. It's a passage that I've translated. It's a passage I've chewed on for months and months and almost years, actually. I remember having someone, well-meaning person at an old church that I was at, read the passage to me and say, not menacingly, but be careful about what you teach. And I was, I being at the time, I was like, being young at the time, I was like, this is helpful. And being older now, I'm 35, it rang true, and it's still a good word to us. And I'm of the opinion that if someone gives you a word, you should at least chew on it for a while and not kind of very casually dismiss it or talk over it or talk under it or just take it and go, well, let's see. How does this fit? Does this fit with Scripture? Does this fit with my experience? Does this fit with the world that I see? And so on and so forth. And so that passage, based on the thumbnail, you already know which passage it is, but I'll read it. This is from James chapter 3, verse 1, and I'm reading from the NRSV, the updated version. And it says, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters, for you know that we who teach will face stricter judgment. For all of us make many mistakes. Anyone who makes no mistakes in speaking is mature or perfect, able to keep their whole body in check with a bridle." And it goes on, if we put bits, it's a little parenthetical, but if we put bits into the mouths of horses to make them obey us, we guide their whole bodies. So a little thing here manages to somehow guide the whole thing, which becomes a nice little metaphoric extension into the idea of the tongue is a small member, as verse 5 says, yet it boasts of great exploits. Or look at ships, though they are in verse 4. Though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, yet they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. And so little things can impact big things. And so I wanted to reflect on this because I've heard people use this as a means of trying to dissuade people from ministry, from pastoral ministry and stuff like that. I think it should be something that sticks, having had a temporary crown put in back here. The verse kind of sticks right here for you, and you're very sensitive when you're chewing on it, so to speak. But I was thinking just of offering kind of a pastoral, theological, and exegetical kind of thought on this passage. And so James, of course, written probably by James, the brother of Jesus, and see my Theology of James, the 23-minute video I put out. But one of the things that I found so helpful in James here, in James 3, is that James, this fits with James' broader theology. James' broader theology of God not showing partiality, God not having any shadows or hidden dark crevices. Whatever you see of Jesus, you see of God. God and Jesus being perfect reflections of one another. What you see, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, to paraphrase, not paraphrase, but to quote John, although John didn't write this. But I love the language of teachers. Didaskaloi. And so you have the language of not many of you should become teachers. And so I think that's interesting already. Didaskos or didaskalos having a routine occurrence in the New Testament, like 55, 58 times, 60 times, about there, just under 60 times perhaps, refers to teachers or instructors, implying some sort of authority, but depending on the context. Some people say it's equivalent to rabbi, or at least kind of a sort of synonym, a related term, a related conceptual term for rabbi. Perhaps, John 1:39 may give that indication. But here you probably don't have rabbi in mind. You have someone who has knowledge, but also has an active role in the community. And this gets into the bigger picture of you can't talk about teachers without talking a bit about James' conception of church. And James's, to step back a little bit, James's conception of church is not guided by kind of our questions of church. We tend to think of who can be a pastor, what does it require to be a pastor, what is the structure of the church, what are the bylaws, what's the constitution, who does what on Sunday mornings, and who does the bulletin, who does this. We tend to think very much in terms of finances and in terms of evangelism, and all those are perfectly fine and reasonable. We need to have those discussions given where we are today. But for James and James's conception of church, you have very different questions being asked. Because in the ancient world, money indicated status and wealth and probably favor from God. If you were wealthy, well, God clearly loves you more because look at your wealth. Maybe you made the right sacrifice, or maybe you prayed the right prayer, or maybe you're just in good with the gods and you don't have that sin or guilt or shame or anything like that. And so that begs the question of why James spends so much time talking to the rich and kind of excoriating them, trying to get them to see that the church is a place of even ground, and you don't get to bring your status and your wealth, or I should say your status, i.e. your wealth, into church with you as if that gives you some sort of higher footing. And at the end of the day, what James says is God does not show favoritism or partiality to anyone, and neither should you. And that's the battle that's kind of raging within the church, at least as James sees it. And I've not been persuaded that we know exactly the church or region, geographic region where James is writing this to. There's many debates over it. But it's written to the diaspora. It's written, as James 1 says, something along the lines of to those who are kind of dispersed or kind of throughout the region. Yeah, the tribes, I think it's the 12 tribes to the 12 tribes of the dispersion. And then he offers the nice greetings to them. And so that's kind of the big picture. You've got this big conception, these big questions about wealth and status kind of going on here. And James's kind of thinking is perfect for our day and age, because very often it's very easy for a charismatic leader, often wealthy, often a dude, to kind of come into a church and be seen and propped up by the church as a natural leader. We call them, natural born leaders, or they're charismatic, or they're this, or they're that. They speak with authority, they speak with their chest, so to speak. And it's very easy to kind of elevate certain types of people based on our culture and context to positions of power. And it's not to say that's bad or like sinful or anything like that, but it is kind of it should give us pause and actually reflect on the broader context of James and about the language of favoritism. Does God show favoritism? And so here we have, not many of you should become teachers, my brothers or my brothers and sisters. And it's an interesting pairing here where we have adelphoi, often translated brothers, but probably is more gender, I would say, neutral. I don't like the language of exclusive or inclusive. I don't think that's helpful. But is it making a gendered claim, or is it making is it making a specific claim, or is it making a general claim? And often adelphoi in the New Testament carries a connotation of siblingness, of familyness, of brothers and sisters or fellow believers, the family or adoption language being a key kind of integrative metaphor for kind of tying men and women together and children together and slaves together and so on and so forth. So here I think it probably has a more wider range of that. James gives us no indication that he shares certain prohibitionary views of gender when it comes to teaching or status. In fact, the whole notion of James's view of status seems to press against the idea of certain prohibitions on, say, women, for example, because that would violate his theology of status and favoritism. But in any case, I think the language of adelphoi is meant to kind of soften some of what he says. And I don't mean soften like he suddenly wonders how they're going to accept this and he's worried about offending them. He's already offended them quite a bit already, I imagine. But I think the point is more, he's trying to get them to understand the intricate and intimate nature of what it means to be the church. And not many of you should become teachers implies perhaps that there's a fight going on, because there already is a fight going on between the wealthy and the poor, those with great status and those with minimal or less status. And so I think James here is kind of giving a rhetorical kind of squeezing or tightening of the screws on the wealthy who think they're entitled to be teachers. And he's essentially telling them that my brothers and sisters, not many of you should become teachers or should seek to wield your knowledge in the church in a leadership or even teaching capacity because you know that we who teach will be judged, depending on the ESV. The ESV says with greater strictness. The NIV says will be judged more strictly. The NRSV, as I read, says will face stricter judgment. And so there's already a little bit here. We will receive this lambano. It's in the, I forget exactly, I can't quite see it. But the lambano here, for you will receive greater or great judgment or condemnation, punishment, sentencing, something like that. But this is something that is obvious because James has already found himself within the we, right? We who teach, or implying we who teach, but the sentence actually reads more neutrally or less. Teaching's assumed, but says literally, for we know that we will receive a greater judgment. So the teaching language is implied and inferred and taken over from the first clause, or the initial clause, and that's implied here. But the focus is on, but we know that, or because we know, or you know that we who teach that we will receive, i.e., those who teach, greater judgment or great judgment. And that should cause that gives a lot of people a bit of fear and trembling, and rightly so. Greater can mean great in terms of volume, large, or spatial, quantity or degree of things. But in any sense, it's not something you want tied to, you don't want it tied as an adjective to judgment, greater judgment. So there's judgment that'll come, but God's judgment will be more focused and specific on teachers, the ones who become teachers, even, as it says. And so one principle already is that no one is natural born leader here. It's those who want to become teachers, the ginomai, right? To become, a being verb of sorts, to happen or something like that. It tells us that God raises up certain people for specific purposes, but it's not very rarely are you seeing that I'm born to do that. I'm born to be a pastor of a church. It's like, well, maybe that's not the case. But even if it is the case, there should come with that a deep reticence and a deep awareness of what that demands of you ethically and theologically. And so rather than being, I think, kind of an easy way of, just kind of flattening the text out and setting it aside, it should cause everyone who is in a position of leadership, whether it's like myself on YouTube, whether it's behind a pulpit, or whether it's in a seminary class, or whether it's at work in a Bible study, or whether it's being a chaplain or being a leader in your family, husbands and wives leading and all that. Or what does that imply? It says, well, be deeply aware of what you say. Partially because, one, God not showing favoritism doesn't mean that you get a pass on what you say in terms of bad behavior or unethical behavior, but also it forces us to stop and go, do not rush into something, because rushing into something can often reveal something about urgency versus wisdom. And it can also tell us a little bit about the nature of, why are you doing this? Is this for your own gain? Is this for branding? Is this for this? Is this for that? Or is this because you feel genuinely called and like, as the politicians say, I can do no other. I have to get into this for the sake of my family or whatever. I don't want the job. I just feel I need to do the job. It gives us a way of kind of thinking honestly about ourselves and the biases we have. And so I think the meaning of the passage and why it's such a difficult passage is that it holds everyone to account. And it calls us to ultimately examine our hearts in the matter. Teachers, theologians, leaders, whether it's on, like I said, YouTube or in pastoral ministry at a church or what have you, will be held to a greater judgment. Some people reckon the phrase means certain things, and I have the commentaries that I found helpful, Scott McKnight's especially. I loved his material on the Jewish nature of James, but he makes this really interesting point. Here, I'll read this as page 268 from, I want to cite my sources. Yeah, the letter of James, the New International Commentary on the New Testament by Scott McKnight. He writes this on page 268. While James urges individuals in the Messianic Christian community not to become teachers, he may be concerned not so much with the number of teachers in the community or even with candidates for the teaching office. I think that's a helpful point. As he is with the impact of too many talking and teaching in irresponsible, unloving ways. And that's why the ethical aspect of this is so important. That's why James often gets shunted to the side in Protestantism or in Baptist circles, because it calls everyone to account and it's thoroughly saturated in the ethics of Jesus. Ethics and ethical discourses, exhortation is not as easy to preach on, especially if you're a preacher like me who reads the text, translates it, and tries to feast on it and takes it seriously and personally. A text should cut deep if you're a good pastor. When he or she gets behind a pulpit and you preach something, and you're not impacted by what you preach, then there's a problem. But it tells us that Jesus fundamentally is so drenched, or is so layered and woven into James, that you can't just read it and not be impacted by it. And that, I think, is a huge theological issue, is that we often prefer propositional statements, like in Romans. I'm being using propositional very loosely and kind of sarcastically, but it's easier to preach on deep theological treatises than it is about ethics. Like, for example, when people preach through Romans, they love preaching from Romans 1 to 11. And then when you hit the ethics section in Romans 12 through 16, people tend to roll their eyes. The commentaries get a lot shorter at that point in time, usually. And you begin to see just a wide range of disinterest in ethical realities within the text. And especially within our modern culture where everyone, generally speaking, has access to internet, access to Amazon Prime, money, and I'm not talking, I'm not wealthy at all at the moment, at least. But you can see all those sorts of things where in a culture of excess, in a culture where I'm in a home, I don't actually have air conditioning, I have a fan right here, but you have AC, you have access to all sorts of things, and you begin to realize, wow, this is all this wealth within our midst. Maybe that's the reason we don't want to preach James, is because it speaks directly to us. It doesn't give anyone a pass. James, like God, doesn't show favoritism, especially towards the wealthy and the rich and the powerful. And maybe it's time for the church to recognize, or some in the church to recognize, that you are the powerful, you are the rich. As Nathan said to David after David committed his grievous sins, you are the man. And that hurts. And that really hurts. And it hurts to preach it because you recognize that you recognize it in yourself. And James, being a good theologian, is not giving anyone a pass. But also it gives us a deep understanding of the brokenness of who we are, and that no matter the amount of money or status or privilege we have, at the end of the day, God's like, I'm not here to show you favoritism. I care nothing for your status or your privilege. I care about the ethical demands that I've given to you and that anyone can do regardless of status, wealth, or privilege. And that's holiness. That's Christian living. That's sanctification. That's mercy. That's justice. That's righteousness in God's world. And that's why not many of you should become teachers. I'll say here, not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters, for you know that we will face stricter judgment. Meaning, because you know what God desires, that God doesn't show favoritism, that God does this, that God does that. Because you know, you will be judged greater. And that's not God sitting over there swinging the sword of Damocles or holding a gun going like, don't say the wrong thing now. Like, that's not how God thinks. But God's in there going like, how you represent me in the world to the church matters. The words you say have impact. The words you say have meaning. And if you mislead people, well, there is a reckoning that comes for that. I mean, as James says, and James is not being cynical, he's being real. In verse 2, he says, for all of us make many mistakes. And, like that happens. And of course, mistakes here, or stumbling language, it's not mistake, but it's stumbling. We all stumble, we stagger, we take a false step, we miss a little bit, but it's not the same as sin. For all of us stumble, or we all stumble, or what have you, many ways, but that's not the same as sin. Stumbling is not the same as sin. I love that James makes a distinction there. And if anyone does not stumble, then what they say, they are a perfect, often translated aner, man, or husband or male. Although here James is probably being a little more, even aner can be used to describe a human being or a male person or what have you. But even then, it can be used pleonastically. It can have some flexibility in the range. But the perfect person, or they say they are perfect, depending on how you render it. If you go for a more neutral understanding, if you go for a more or general versus exclusive. But even then, any person who makes a mistake in speaking is mature or perfect, meaning you've gotten to the point where stumbling is different from sinning, but also you're not as worried about this because you know who God is. Able to keep their whole body in check with a bridle. And of course, bridle language is used, I think, only here in James. Yep, bridle language is used only here in James. Keeping the whole body, and able to bridle the whole body. And of course, dunatos being power, having the power to bridle the entire body. Meaning that the little things, and the bit in the mouth, and having been around horses extensively, you put a bridle in, that 1,000-pound animal is at your mercy if you know what you're doing, for good or for ill. And what I love about this passage right here is the whole body is kept in check with a bridle. And if we put bits in the mouth, we guide their whole bodies. Basically, the little things you do will steer ships, will guide you through the waters, and your tongue is yet a small member or part of you, but it boasts of great exploits. And I think then the scary thing that follows is how great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. that a small spark leads to a bigger thing. And the tongue is a fire. The tongue is placed among our members and as a world of iniquity. It stains the whole body, sets on fire the cycle of life, and is itself set on fire by Gehenna. And so Gehenna there being judgment. And of course, I'm not convinced that stricter judgment here refers to purely or only to eschatological judgment, although I do think it includes that. I do think it comes with a very strong referendum on human pride, on human complacency, and on human injustice. And I think those are big issues in the church. And I think that's why we should be very, I would say, reticent to make these sorts of claims about the New Testament specifically, but also recognizing that church leadership, church teaching is something that should cause us to go very slowly, like to recognize that things take time. And we live in an age where swiftness is seen as a form of wisdom or as a virtue. And some things you need to be quick on, and that can be virtuous. But I think for a lot of us, we need to, myself included, we need to recognize that swiftness is not the same as wisdom. Wisdom is being able to discern and understand and grow and, as I said, chew or feast on what has been given to you. And I think for many of us, myself included, our culture does not reward that. Our culture culture, generally speaking, rewards speed. It rewards power or stepping above others to get what you want. It values favoritism. And that is contrary to what we see in James's theology. And I think focusing on that and being aware of that will cause us to really, really, really reflect on our hearts when it comes to this. When it comes to, say, someone like Mark Driscoll, not many of you should become teachers. That should give us great pause on, well, look around, like, who have we put up with? Who have we bolstered? Who have we lied for? Who have we bought the books for? Who have we exalted or showed favoritism for when we wouldn't have shown that to someone else? Are we showing John MacArthur a type of favoritism when we accept his bad behavior and we don't accept, or whether when we refuse to accept his bad behavior or acknowledge it or stand up against it, but we would never accept that sort of thing from the church down the street or from the Methodist minister over there, from the Presbyterian minister over there, or what have you, right? It becomes very easy to give others in our tribe a pass, to let others kind of get away with bad behavior or unethical behavior. And I think the church, in cleaning house and in being righteous, needs to ask that question or make the statement seriously. Not many of us should become teachers. We should be very slow and very wise with who we allow and encourage and empower and ordain and push forward into pastoral leadership, or in terms of teachers, teaching roles, teaching movements. And I think at the end of the day, if we're able to do that, then I think we will not only grow as a church, we will be a place of refuge as well. Because a church that cares about its leadership and is not interested in being fed red meat or dancing up in tribalistic fashion about all the sorts of things that get us hot under the collar is a church that will probably survive in the 21st century. Because people at the end of the day, they don't want this partisanship. They don't want what's good for thee isn't good for me, or hey, he's one of us, we got to protect him. We got to not touch God's anointed, so on and so forth. I think we need to be very slow and reflective of that in our world. Because who we put forth as our pastoral representative, as our shepherd, as our guide, as our theologian in training or pastor theologian or whoever, is reflective of the overall character and tenor of the church at large. And woe to us if we show favoritism to that man or woman who is given pastoral oversight, pastoral care, pastoral leadership. And may that give us fear and trembling. May that give us a sense of moving slow, moving with wisdom, moving with character, moving with integrity, moving as fast as the Spirit demands of us, and praying and engaging theologically with the text of Scripture and reading the text of Scripture and understanding what James says. In James chapter 3, verse 13, he says straight up, "Who is wise and knowledgeable among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be arrogant and lie about the truth. This is not wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. What you tolerate in the church will become the culture of the church, the DNA of the church tomorrow. But the wisdom from above," in verse 17, "is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." And hopefully that sticks right here for you as it does for me. And hopefully we can therefore be challenged to ask better questions and to seek above all else the things that are from above. God bless you all. Hope this is helpful. Let me know in the comments below what you think, what your thoughts are on the passage, how this applies to pastoral ministry. I've thrown out a few case examples. I've kept other examples vague for intentional reasons, for obvious reasons, I think. If you like what you've seen, make sure to like, share, subscribe. If you've got the financial means, I'd love for you to become a Patreon supporter. Click down on the description below if you'd like to, or if you can't, then share it for others and tell other people to share. Why not? I know we're all living in Joe Biden's economy, and the previous economy, and then the previous economy, and the previous. Everything's crashing, and everything's good. So I understand if you can't, but thank you for being here. Thank you for your subscription. Thank you for your time. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May His face shine above you. And at the end of the day, seek above all the things of wisdom found in the Spirit, given to us by the Son, founded for us by the Father. Take care, everyone.